I'm recovering from a bit of a cold here, so sorry if this is a bit nasally, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about, just materialism and then alternatives to that. Like, what are our alternative ways to thinking about things, and then how can we package alternatives? And part of where this is coming from is I'm just kind of just a little bit dissatisfied with arguments against materialism that I've heard. I think if you were to go on the internet just to try to learn about what different people think, you might hear a religious person talking about their religious worldview, and then an atheist talking about a more scientific worldview. And I don't think that Christians or religious people do a great job of framing the conversation in a way that understands where the materialists are coming from. I think a lot of times Christians try to make an argument, like your everyday apologist on the internet might try and make some argument for the immaterial nature of the soul or the mind, or an argument for some particular miracle. But that doesn't really tell you how they actually think about things. It doesn't give you a framework for thinking about the world, which is an alternative to materialism. It just tries to crash materialism into the ground without really understanding the materialist behind it. This lighting should be a bit better. So what I want to do is to try and provide an argument against materialism, which is sensitive to where materialists are coming from. And I call it, I want to call it the Tower of Babel argument, or the argument from multiple language games, just to give it something catchy that'll hopefully help it stick in the minds of people here. So what I want to do is I want to just talk briefly about what materialism is, and then basically argue that it's really just physics, if you think about it. And then you could ask, well, what's physics? Is it the only game in town? And then when you pick apart what it actually is, you almost immediately realize that it's not the only game in town. So when people talk about their materialism, you might hear something in college, college students saying, I believe in science over religion, right? This isn't a very philosophically nuanced thing to say. It's just kind of some expression of a scientific worldview. But I think that this commitment to a scientific worldview is something that more sophisticated materialists share. So just take Sean Carroll, for example. He's this kind of outspoken naturalist and physicist. The way he articulates his materialism is that the universe is just an evolving wave function. A wave function is a quantum mechanics concept with a specific mathematical definition, right? Another way of putting this, which I think he would agree with, is that the human being is fundamentally a biological phenomenon. And if the human being is fundamentally a biological phenomenon, then that comes from the universe just being a physical entity, right? I gotta watch that. It comes from the assumption that the universe is just reducibly physical. And so if the universe is physics, if physics is the only way of coming up with principles that describe the universe, if that's your assumption, can we lay out the assumptions in a more philosophically rigorous way, right? So the belief that physics is really the only game in town, right? What does that mean? Like, what is physics? To me, so I have a degree in physics, and my takeaway is that there's a series of assumptions of what you're doing, of what physics is, right? First of all, you're assuming that the universe is quantifiable, right? You're assuming that the universe and everything in it is a bunch of interacting quantities. And therefore, you can throw math at the universe and come up with mathematical principles, right? And that's what physics is. It's coming up with mathematical principles which are the laws of nature, which govern the universe. So what you're doing, you could think about physics as a three-step process. So number one is make an assumption about reality, right? It's quantifiable. Number 2 is develop a language in the natural vocabulary of that assumption, right? So if your assumption is the world is quantifiable, the natural language of quantities is math, right? And then the third thing is you go out into the world and try to make true statements in that language, right? So go out and come up with mathematical principles which govern the universe. So again, 3-step process: make some assumptions about what reality is, develop a language in the natural vocabulary of those assumptions, and then go out into the world and find true statements, right? And try and uncover the principles and express them in that language. So for physics, again, this is, assume that the universe is quantifiable. Go develop your language of quantities, go develop your math, and then go out into the world and try and discover the mathematical principles behind the universe. So the point that I want to make is we do this process in other areas of life, right? We are in the business of making assumptions about our different situations, developing a language game to talk about the situation, and then trying to make true statements in that language. So if you're, think about any conversation you had that went really well. Like, what's just a really good conversation you had with a friend? Or think about a fight you had. Like, just what's a conversation that went catastrophically wrong. Well, what went wrong, right? What went right? Like if I had a conversation about purpose one time, with one of my friends, and there seemed to be a pattern, right? So I was listening to him about how he thinks about purpose and how he's trying to find purpose in life. And then just me listening to him laying out his ideas and laying out his experiences, that just opened him up to hearing my way of talking about it. And we were kind of coming at this from different places. And so I think we really learned something about each other, and it was a great conversation. And so one guiding principle for conversations, it might be, sorry, there's that cold again. So a guiding principle for conversations might be, for certain conversations might be let them talk about their experience, and that'll open them up to hearing about your experiences, right? But not all of life is conversations, right? Conversations is a subset, of relationships, and relationships is a subset of the human experience. So my point is you're in the business of finding patterns and articulating them in a language that isn't mathematical. Like, we're just in the business as human beings of talking about our experiences in a way that someone else can relate to. And the way we do that is we make it a little bit abstract. We come up with principles and articulate them in a language that we think other people can relate to. Sports are a really poignant example of this that kind of flesh out the idea, where if your coach is, you're at baseball practice, you're playing third base, you're fielding ground balls, coach tells you, keep your butt down, right? Keep your butt down. Like, why do you want to keep your butt down? Well, it helps you field ground balls, but why do you want to field ground balls? Because it helps you get outs. Why do you want to get outs? Well, that's because you want your team to win the game, right? And so there's a whole hierarchy of principles, let's say, which govern a sport. And in sports, they're very clearly laid out. But thinking in a principled way about other areas of life is just something we do. We're not really aware of it. So in relationships, right, a guiding principle might be, like I said before, hey, listen to their experiences and the way they think about things, and that'll open them up to hearing about your ideas and experiences. Or another guiding principle might be, hey, if you have some negative emotion from an unrelated incident, don't take that into a conversation with somebody, right? That might just be a guiding principle for having better conversations in certain circumstances. But this is all kind of circumstantial wisdom, which is articulated not in physics language. It's not mathematically articulated. So you might ask, well, hey, is the universe, or I shouldn't say the universe, is the human experience captured by principles which aren't physics, right? They're not physical principles, but the human experience is still, there are still principles in play, which aren't physics. And that's the basic intuition that I want people to take away. Then you might say, well, look, you're kind of articulating situational wisdom here about baseball and conversations and relationships. Doesn't that just reduce to biology, right? Isn't the human a biological phenomenon? So part of being a biological human is, just being, near other people in social contexts. Like, isn't there fields of biology dedicated to, studying these things? What I want to say is, again, think philosophically here about physics and what it was doing, which is it's making an assumption about reality and then coming up with a language, a vocabulary in the language of your assumption, and then going out and making true statements. So if we articulate moral principles or principles for conversations or relationships or principles for finding purpose in life, should we assume just that those principles will reduce to physics? And my answer is no. One way to flesh this out is physical principles don't reduce to other physical principles. So classical mechanics doesn't reduce to quantum mechanics. Like quantum mechanics, you can't derive classical mechanics from quantum mechanics because classical mechanics is false. Classical mechanics assumes that the universe is a bunch of point masses crashing into each other, and that's just not what the universe is. Like we aren't made of a bunch of point masses, right? We know now that wave functions are a much more accurate way of talking about the world. Yet, classical mechanics is a great way to talk about everyday experience, and we engineers still use it to analyze mechanical systems and build bridges and houses, right? So we still use classical mechanics even because it's a useful approximation, even though it's not quite true. It's approximately true, and that makes it very useful. And I think we're full of these approximate truths as humans. I think we're in the business of talking about relationships and talking about navigating the interior life and social obligations and finding purpose and happiness. And we're in the business of all these things, and we have different language games to talk about them. And the principles that we come up with in those different vocabularies, they just obviously won't reduce to physics. Physics doesn't reduce to other physics when we do that. And that's kind of what I want to take away. And this is something you can take home. This is portable, right? Or next time you're in the business of trying to articulate a situation with your significant other, with your family, with anyone, like if you're trying to articulate your situation and your experiences to people, try and reflect on what you were doing. Like you weren't trying to come up with mathematical statements for this. You were just trying to come up with a vocabulary to describe the situation in the natural vocabulary of the situation, right? You're not gonna impose a mathematical thinking on a situation. You're gonna let the situation give you the vocabulary, if that makes sense. And so the principles that you come up with, which were at play in your situation, they're not going to be physics. So like if you're walking on the sidewalk, you see a guy kick a stray cat aside, who knows why, he was in a rush. The moral description of that situation is what's relevant, right? You don't really care about the physics. It's not so much. You don't really care about, whether that guy was living a purposeful life. You care about, it's wrong to kick cats, right? And you care about the moral description of the situation. And so you're going to appeal to moral principles if you were to dialogue with that guy. Or if you're talking about that guy with your friends, you're going to say what he did was wrong and blah, blah, blah. But you're talking about it in a moral language, and you're talking about the situation in terms of principles which aren't physics. So I think I'm kind of beating a dead horse here. But what I'm trying to say is when you're thinking about different situations and experiences you have and you're trying to articulate them, try and realize I'm not coming up with physical principles to talk about this situation. And you should ask yourself, well, if that's the case, are physical principles the only principles at work in the world? When you don't even use physical principles to talk about your experiences, your everyday experiences. So that would be the argument for multiple language games, which is if we have multiple language games, not just math, but we have language games for, again, navigating the interior life, relationships, happiness, purpose. If we have different language games, that means we're going to come up with different principles for different situations. Like we're going to realize that different principles are at play in different corners of the human experience. And it's not all physics, because again, even physics doesn't reduce to other physics. So why should we assume that non-physical principles just reduce to physics? I don't think we have a good reason to. So that's the basic intuition. Sorry for the coughing. Thanks for tuning in. And I'm looking forward to developing this idea more and talking to people about it and, trying to refine it a little bit. So thanks for tuning in. Until next time.